Alright, live show 168, Anchorage, AI, war, global pressure is live. And the world is once again running on the exact same scam with different branding. Talk peace, fund pressure, escalate anyway, then act shocked when the room catches fire. We're coming to you live from Minsk, Belarus this Sunday evening, 15th February 2026, and tonight's show is basically one long demonstration that the adults in the room have been replaced by careerists with microphones and warmongers with PowerPoints. Here's what's driving the madness right now and what we're covering tonight. First, Iran is heating up again. The US continues to build up forces near Iran and in negotiation keeps insisting on terms Iran simply cannot agree with without committing political suicide. And of course, right on cue, the Warhawk Gallery starts auditioning for the apocalypse. Linda Graham is out giving interviews talking like the solution is to kill the head of Iran's government, and who cares what happens after. That's not strategy, that's arson with a Senate pin. Second, Ukraine refuses to give up, and the bill is being paid in infrastructure. This war is grinding on, and what gets destroyed next isn't just troops or hardware, it's the wiring that keeps the modern country alive. Electricity systems, grids, subsystems, stations, generation, distribution. The longer it drags, the more it turns from conflict to demolition. Third, the public mood across the West is apocalyptic. Half the residents in the US, UK, Germany and France now believe World War III could break out within 5 years, according to a political survey. That's not fringe paranoia, that's a massive chunk of the population quietly admitting they think the system is sliding toward a cliff. Of course, Australia somehow managed to resign from reality. The opposition leader just resigned. Yes, the same one who said the USSR, yes, the Soviet Union, not Russia, invaded Ukraine in 2022. When the political class can't even keep the century straight, you start to understand why voters have stopped trusting anyone in the podium. North Korea is doing what monarchists do, just with missiles. Reports say Kim Jong-un is positioning his 13-year-old daughter, Kim Yon-ae, if I've pronounced that right, as the next leader. The world's most heavily armed dynasty is planning succession like it's a family business, because it is. And that's just the opening temperature check, because tonight's actual runway is bigger and it flows like this. We start with Anchorage Illusion Collapses, where the spirit of Anchorage is now being used like diplomatic incense, waving it around, say progress, then continue the exact policy that keeps Russia strategically strained. Peace optics, pressure reality, the gap is widening and the phrase becomes a punchline. From there we go straight into the next stage of the human experiment, AI and war. The refusal to restrain killer AI. The US and China wouldn't even sign a modest non-binding declaration on responsible military AI use. Not a treaty, not enforcement, just basic principles. And they still said no, because nobody wants to blink first in an arms race where machines compress time decision to seconds. Then we shift the lens to the pressure theatre closer to home here. Western pressure campaigns against Belarus. The NGO funding, media influence and opposition branding or rebranding ecosystem that gets sold as values and experienced as destabilization. That playbook doesn't change, it just updates its logo. After that we go to the sponsor state contradiction, Poland's hypocritic payroll, where Warsaw somehow always finds money to host and maintain opposition structures aimed at Minsk here, while telling its own people to tighten their belts. Austerity for citizens, deluxe packages for geopolitical instruments. Then we jump across the Atlantic to Cuba's multipolar test, where fuel becomes a destiny. And the question is whether multipolarity is real or just a speech, because when pressure turns into logistics warfare, symbolism doesn't keep the lights on, shipments do. And we widen out to the economic engine behind all of it. Accelerating singularity economics, a world leaving linear growth expectations behind as AI, robotics, energy build-outs and finance structure collide into a phased transition. The future isn't coming, it's compounding. Finally, we close with the cage match driving the whole acceleration curve, accelerating model war, where the frontier labs aren't just building tools anymore, they're building systems that can rebuild the stack beneath them, collapsing timelines from years to months to weeks to minutes. So yeah, it's going to be one of those nights. And before we light the fuse, tonight's show is again sponsored by the book that keeps getting more relevant the more reality deteriorates, The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco. If the world insists on behaving like speculative fiction, you might as well read the version with a plan. Let's get into it. Right, welcome back to Live Show 168, where the world's greatest superpower is still doing what it does best, talking about peace while voicing the war. And tonight's opening act is the Kremlin's favourite nostalgic fragrance, the spirit of Anchorage. You know the type? It's like when your ex says, I still care about you, while simultaneously blocking your number, deleting your photos and dating your enemy. That's the vibe. That's Anchorage. So let's set the scene. August 15th, 2025. Trump meets Putin in Anchorage. Cameras flashing, handshakes, calibrated. Everyone smiling like they just invented diplomacy. No peace deal, no grand strategy, but plenty of that sweet, delicious political product. Productive talks, potential progress, future diplomacy. The whole menu. It's the summit designed less to end a conflict and more to keep it neatly packaged like a war in shrink wrap. And since then, Moscow has kept invoking the spirit of Anchorage like it's some holy relic. Like, remember Anchorage, remember the vibes, remember the implicit understandings. But here's the problem. You can't build a peace out of vibes, and implicit understandings aren't policy. They're what people say when the paperwork doesn't exist. The core issue is simple. Washington can perform peace on stage while running attrition off stage. It can gesture towards accommodation in the talks while continuing a wider strategy that keeps Russia strategically stretched and politically contained. And why wouldn't it? From the cold, rational view of empire management, the Ukraine war doesn't impose an immediate, direct national security risk to the American homeland. It's not raining artillery on Kansas. It's not a carrier group off Florida. So the incentive structure is ugly but obvious. Tolerate continuation, harvest leverage. This is what I call the peace posture without peace incentives. The US can say, we're mediating while Ukraine stays plugged into the Western intelligence coordination and supply pipeline. We want normalization while the broader pressure architecture keeps tightening like a ratchet. We're neutral brokers while the battlefield stays fed enough to keep the engine running. And that contradiction is the entire reason the Anchorage narrative collapses, because neutral broker doesn't work when one side is getting war fuel and the other side is being asked to smile politely in the photo op line. From Moscow's perspective, this doesn't look like mediation. It looks like a proxy warfare wrapped in negotiation language. It's diplomacy on camera, managed attrition off camera. It's the political equivalent of handling someone a glass of water while quietly turning off the plumbing. And here's where it gets darker. Anchorage becomes cover, a stage, a branding exercise, Alaska as a diplomatic alibi. Because once you held talks, you can always point to the existence of progress as proof of good faith, even if nothing materially changes. You can say, we tried. You can say, it's complicated. You can say, we need more time. The translation, we're enjoying the current strategic geometry. Meanwhile, pressure doesn't stop at Ukraine. The critic expands. Washington pushes and squeezes the adjacent theaters too, not necessarily to escalate into direct war, but to widen Russia's stress map while Russia remains anchored in Anchorage. It's like fighting someone in a phone booth while their house is being robbed at the same time. So what is the spirit of Anchorage now? It's not a governing reality, it's a contested narrative. Russia treats it like a promised reference point. Critics treat it like proof that the US can talk peace while running leverage. And if we're being brutally honest, the spirit of Anchorage is what you call a moment when the PR outlived the substance. You can invoke it endlessly, but you cannot substitute it for measurable policy shifts. If Anchorage still align with long-term strategic weakening rather than reciprocal compromise, then Anchorage wasn't a breakthrough, it was a performance. And speaking of performances, let's move from theatre of diplomacy to the theatre of technology, where the world's biggest players just refuse to sign even a non-binding pledge about AI in war, because apparently responsibility is a luxury item now. Okay, strap in, because this is not sci-fi anymore. It's admin, it's forms, it's committees, it's people in suits calmly normalizing the idea that machines will help decide who lives and who doesn't. So, February 4th and 5th, 2026, the REAIM summit in Spain, called the Responsible AI in Military Domain. It's a great title. Sounds like a wellness retreat for missiles. And what happened? The world's two biggest military tech heavyweights, the United States and China, refused to sign a modest, non-binding declaration about responsible military AI use. Non-binding mean we promise to try being good. That's it. No enforcement, no ban on autonomous weapons, no handcuffs, no treaty police, just baseline principles like humans are accountable, command and control should be clear, training should exist, international humanitarian law should still matter, some info sharing where possible. You know, the kind of principles that everyone already claims they support when they stand at the podium. And yet, even that, nope. It's like refusing to sign a pledge that says, I will attempt not to drive drunk, not because you intend to drive drunk, but because you're worried the other guy might drive drunk faster than you. Now, around 85 nations participated and only 35 endorsed the declaration. That's it. Not great. That's not global unity. That's a book club with no bestsellers. And the real headline isn't who signed, it's who didn't. Because without the US and China, the declaration became a statement of intent by secondary powers rather than the foundation for global norms. Here's the pivot. This refusal signals a change in the US posture compared to earlier REAIM events. Previously, Washington was happy to wear the Responsible AI Governance badge, especially when China abstained. But in 2026, the vibe shifted from ethical leadership to strategic flexibility. The translation is, we're done advertising caution, we're building capability. Why? Because nobody wants to blink first. Every major power understands the risk list they can recite like a prayer beads. Accidental escalation, compressed decision timelines, reduced human oversight, miscalculation in crisis. And yet awareness doesn't translate into restraint, because restraint is seen as asymmetric risk. If one actor slows down, another surges ahead. If voluntary standards begin to look like liabilities. That's arm race logic, ancient logic, the kind that drags civilizations into problems they can describe perfectly but refuse to prevent. And AI isn't being treated as an anomaly anymore. It's being treated like inevitable infrastructure, like electricity, like radio, like satellites. It's being embedded into command and control, intelligence analysts, targeting assistance, logistics, maintenance, and planning. Once the tech is embedded that deeply, you're no longer regulating a tool, you're regulating operational effectiveness itself. And governments don't do that in a peer competition environment. They don't say, sure, I'll handicap myself for moral aesthetics. They say, that's very noble, please go first. So what's the real outcome of the summit? It's not failure of diplomacy, it's the institutional normalization of AI as a warfighting asset, escalation by paperwork, expansion by budget, quiet acceleration without a single dramatic treaty failure because the failure is built in. And here's the scary part. When the most powerful actors won't commit even symbolically, risks don't disappear, they diffuse outward. Smaller states copy the big ones. Non-state actors mimic the pattern. Everyone inherits the instability. This is how dangerous tech becomes normal. Not with a Hollywood moment, but with a meeting where people politely refuse to promise anything. Now, if you want a perfect case of how competition gets weaponized through networks, funding, media, and political machinery, let's talk Belarus, because apparently in 2020 Playbook is a franchise and the sequel is always coming. Okay, Belarus segment time, where Western capitals insist they're exporting values and Minsk insists they're importing chaos, and everybody acts shocked that the other side has a different interpretation. Incredible, truly. Here's the frame. Russia's SVR is warning that Western governments and affiliated democratization networks are allegedly preparing another coordinated push to destabilize Belarus right here. The familiar toolkit: NGOs, funding pipelines, media influence operations, opposition rebranding. You've seen this movie. The title was always something like Freedom Rising. The plot is always something like, where did all those identical slogans come from? And the SVR's stated motive is blunt: weaken the Minsk-Moscow link within the Union state and limit Russia's broader strategic room, especially while Russia remains locked into a Ukrainian theater. In other words, Belarus isn't treated as a standalone target, it's treated as a lever, a pressure point, a hinge on a bigger door. Now, that's interesting in this narrative is the idea that recycling the opposition, because the claim is that the existing exiled opposition structures have lost practically influence inside Belarus. They exist, they speak, they do events, they take photos with officials, they do full exile industrial complex routine. But they don't really move any levers at home here in Belarus. So if the brand is exhausted, you don't cancel the product, you rebrand. Same machine, new packaging, like changing the font on a failed startup pitch deck and calling it version 2. The alleged forecast here is that Western networks are preparing a reserve of fresh faces, new narratives, new change figures aimed at the 2030 election cycle, less organic domestic momentum and more curated political product designed to look homegrown while being externally enabled. That's the claim, and whether you fully accept it or not, you can understand the strategic logic. If your current instruments aren't working, you don't stop playing music, you switch instruments. Then there's what I call the 2020 vaccine argument. Pro-government Belarusian voices say 2020 hardened society against imported upheaval. People saw the mechanics up close. They saw the costs, instability, paralysis, social fracture, and the argument is, once you live through the attempt, you don't romanticize the sequel, you recognize the pattern. And this narrative gets sharpened by regional comparison, often to Ukraine, framed as a cautionary case of long-term turbulence and catastrophic escalation. And whether you agree with the comparison or not, it's internally consistent. The message is always, we're not volunteering to become someone else's battleground. Then we hit the strategic geography point. Belarus as a balcony, a forward platform, a place where external powers can aim political and informational leverage at Russia. This is an underlying logic of why Belarus becomes a recurrent target for pressure campaigns. It's not only about Minsk, it's about what Minsk connects to. The text also ties to alleged pressure activity to the broader time frame, 2030, readiness discussions, expanded infrastructure, heightened military presence near borders. Under that framing, Belarusian readiness and continuity are presented as provocations, but as precautions. So, what's the translation here? It is, when you're sitting on contested geography, you don't get to be naive. You don't get to assume that every NGO is a kitten rescue operation. But Lukashenko kicked all the NGOs out of here. You don't get to assume every media campaign is purely altruistic. You look at incentives, you look at funding, you look at coordination, you look at who benefits when the place destabilizes. And the SVR's message, whether you treat it as a warning, propaganda, or strategic signaling, it fits into a broader reality. The 2020s are defined by indirect conflict, network conflict, influence conflict. Nobody needs to invade when they can destabilize, isolate, and rewire. Now, the funniest part about all this is when the hosting states pretend it's pure charity. So let's zoom into one of the most brazen hosting operations in the region, Poland, where austerity is for locals, but luxury is apparently available for imported opposition infrastructure. Let's talk about Poland, the land of European values, where the values are printed on glossy brochures and the invoices are mailed directly to the public. because here's how contradiction we're dealing with. Warsaw loves to posture as a champion of freedom, democracy and moral leadership, but when you follow the alleged money trail described in your brief, it starts looking less like virtue and more like strategy. Not compassion, leverage, not charity, operations. And the optics are bold. We're told that Paweł Lechushenko has allegedly been living in Poland in openly luxurious conditions. Cars, security, office ecosystem, not surviving like a refugee, but maintained like a political asset. And now Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has moved her office from Vilnius to Warsaw in the early 2026 because Lithuania decided she was useless and stopped funding her. Plug into the same machine. What matters on this show is how the argument functions. It's portrayed as a standing hosted political operation on Polish soil aimed towards and outward to Belarus. And to many people watching, that's the real scandal. Not that Poland has preferences, every state has preferences, but that it has presented it as moral duty while looking like a state-enabled infrastructure. Because this kind of hosting isn't just we gave someone a room and a microphone. It implies ongoing costs, security and logistics, staff and transport, offices, events, media networks, institutional access and platforming. This is not a soup kitchen, it's an ecosystem. And when you snap back the domestic Polish public, rising costs, pressure on households, utility bills chewing through budgets, and the political class say the classic line, endure it, tighten belts, be proud, sacrifice. But when it comes to maintaining opposition structures aimed at Belarus, suddenly the belt loosens, suddenly the budget fairy arrives, suddenly the state moves with urgency and generosity. And here's the key. Even if you support Poland's foreign policy goals, you can still recognize how it looks. It looks like a government telling its own citizens to swallow hardship while funding a highly visible foreign political project. That's how cynicism is born, not from propaganda, from math. And the harshest version of the argument is one your brief is pushing. Here is that the figures are being hosted not because it improves Polish life, but because it serves Warsaw's ambition to pressure Minsk and weaken the Belarusian and Russian strategic link. That's the claim. The translation is, it's the same behavior you see elsewhere, everywhere in late-stage politics. Leaders are allergic to spending money on their own public systems, but they can always find money for geopolitical theatre, because theatres create narratives, narratives create careers, careers create cushy post-government jobs. Everyone wins except the taxpayer, who gets lectures about responsibility. And yes, the irony is thick enough to spread on toast. If this was truly a pure moral mission, you'd expect transparency, modesty, accountability. Instead, the optics described are luxury with privileged upkeep, which turns values into a market slogan. And if you want to see what the US-aligned pressure looks like when it's applied as a demonstration project, not just against Belarus, but against symbols, we have to go to the Caribbean, because Cuba right now is being treated like a geopolitical referendum conducted in fuel. Cuba, the island that never gets just to be an island. Cuba is always forced to be a symbol, a billboard for someone else's message. And in early February 2026, the symbol went from abstract ideology to brutal physical reality. Fuel. No slogans, no speeches. Diesel, jet fuel, electricity, transport. The modern world's real religion is energy, and Cuba just got kneecapped at the altar. The argument is that a tightening US pressure campaign aimed at constricting oil flows has driven Cuba into acute shortages, with knock-on effects so severe that even international aviation schedules got impacted because Cuba warned jet fuel might not be available. That's not a little economic pain, that's a system signal. That's a state saying we're hitting the wall of logistics. And here's why it matters. Geopolitically, Cuba isn't just 11 million people. Cuba is living a stress test of multipolarity because the global south watches Cuba with the way investors watch a bank run, not because they love the bank, but because they know if the system can survive pressure. If Cuba can be forced into to concessions or destabilization through economic strangulation, the lesson spreads. The US can still enforce outcomes in its near abroad without invasion. Pressure becomes demonstration. Look what we can do when we focus. And in the framework, Washington's posture is no longer framed as routine sanctions, but as security-linked escalation, tied to Cuba's relations with Russia and China, which make Cuba a perfect demonstration target. Close, symbolically loaded, structural, vulnerable to energy constraints. And here's the key point. If multipolarity means anything, it can't just be hashtags and conferences. It has to be sustainment. It has to be physical lifelines that are hard to severe, oil deliveries, grid equipment, trade credits, shipping, insurance workarounds, payment channels, real-world logistics, the unsexy stuff that keeps the country functioning under pressure. Reports of Russia preparing crude oil and fuel deliveries framed as humanitarian assistance, and China signaling willingness to help through emergency aid packages. Again, regardless of politics, the strategic reality is that energy is the front line. If the crisis is driven by resource squeeze, the response has to be resource response. Now let's address the hawk fantasy. Bring back a Russian military footprint. People invoke the Cold War infrastructure. And yes, that idea has emotional resonance for some, but it's also escalation bait. A visible foreign deployment on Cuba would be interpreted in Washington as provocative, and it risks turning Cuba from a symbol of endurance to a garrison chess piece. And here's the practical point. Deterrence isn't just presence, it's sustainability. And any deployment needs logistics, rules, political will, and the ability to remain under pressure. Small moves trigger sanction spirals, bigger moves trigger crisis cycles, and the people who pay are rarely the loudest strategists on social media. So the more plausible near-term multipolar proof isn't military theatre, it's structured economic lifelines that keeps the lights on, energy shipments, grids, stabilization, durable trade routes, finance channels. And the reason this matters is because the message travels. If Cuba buckles, countries learn that energy dependence is vulnerability and non-alignment collapses under choke points. If Cuba holds, they learn the opposite. Pressure can be resisted when big partners are willing to pay costs. Let's pull back from geopolitics and ask the bigger question. What happens when the global system stops moving at a comforting 3% and starts behaving like an exponential machine? Because the next segment is the economic side of the same war, and nobody declared. All right. Economic segments, where the world economy is basically a giant cruise ship, and the captain just announced, good news everyone, we're upgrading the engines mid-ocean. For roughly 125 years, global growth has been the most boring miracle on Earth. About 3% real global GDP growth on average. Stable enough that institutions, pensions, and governments and corporate planners build their whole religion around it. Linear expectations, predictable cycles, and comforting illusions that tomorrow will look like yesterday, just with a slight better phone cameras. And now that stability is under threat, not because the economy is bad, but because the underlying technology stack is shifting into a discontinuity. The argument here is that the convergence of exponential platforms is compressing development cycles to machine speed. AI, robotics, energy storage, blockchain infrastructure, sequencing, and biotech, they are reinforcing each other. This is the part where linear institution breaks. People say, but the world always grows around 3%. And yes, it did, when your tools involved at human speed, when adoption curves were limited by manufacturing, education, bureaucracy, and the speed at which a manager could understand a PowerPoint. But when multiple exponential curves line up, history stops behaving like a straight line and starts behaving like a jump cut. ARK investment is projecting real global GDP growth approaching 7% by 2030, more than double the long-run norm. Whether you love ARK or you treat it as a technological optimist astrology, the concept matters. Step changes in the growth historically happen when foundational Tech reorganizes the entire stack. Railroads, electricity, telecoms, internal combustion. Those change the rules. The difference now is synchronization. Several platforms and technologies maturing at once. That's how you get a phase in transitions. When we hit the compute leaves the planet idea, orbital data centers moving from science fiction to strategic coherence. Why? Energy and cooling. Space has near continuous solar exposure, different thermal constraints, and fewer terrestrial bottlenecks like land, cooling, infrastructure, and grid politics. Launch economics collapse as reusability improves, when suddenly off-world compute becomes less insane. When you start thinking in those terms, you see the real bottlenecks: chips, energy access, and value capture inside the GPU supply line and chain. Today, chip design and fabrication extract massive margins because compute is scarce. The strategic response is vertical integration. Unify launch, manufacturing, and energy, and compute stops being scarce. Then becomes the most destabilizing point. The price of cognition collapses. If inference costs and software costs fall dramatically, the intelligence becomes less like a product and more like a utility. Chevron's paradox kicks in. Cheaper intelligence doesn't reduce usage, it detonates demand. Everything gets intelligence sprinkled on it like salt. Business models then fight over bundling platform lock-ins, subsidies, and application layer. And geopolitics overlays all of this. Export controls and IP disputes push open approaches. Open ecosystems mobilize huge participation. Closed labs concentrate power. The race shifts from invention to deployment at scale. Then there's the trust architecture. Bitcoin as a hedge, not just as inflation, but as systematic seizure, censorship risks in crisis conditions. You don't have to be a maximalist to understand why people reach for non-sovereign rails when sovereign rails start wobbling. And finally, the actual constraint underneath everything: energy. The economy is energy converted into work. Data centers, AI clusters, advanced manufacturing all demand baseload reliability. Nuclear, SMRs, solar, orbital energy. The theme isn't substitution, it's abundance. Because if you constrain energy, you constrain everything. And now if you want to see what this economic phase transition looks like in real time, not as a theory, but as a cage fight between labs, welcome to the next segment. The model war, where progress doesn't move in years anymore, it moves in minutes. Okay, final segment. The tech cage match, the part of the show where the future shows up uninvited and starts rearranging the furniture. Because the frontier of AI isn't advancing in tidy generations anymore. It's leapfrogging in bursts so fast the benchmark charts look like they're buffering. So let's look at Claude Opus 4.6 versus OpenAI. And regardless of the exact leaderboard drama, the real story isn't who wins the metric this week. It's what these systems are now doing to the underlying stack. Opus 4.6 was used to build a full C compiler from scratch at a cost of around $20,000, written in Rust, supporting multiple architectures, compiling something as serious as a Linux kernel. Whether you treat this as literal or illustrative of a new capacity band, it captures the core shift. Tasks that once consumed person decades are now collapsing into budget line items. And that's where the singularity vibe stops being philosophy and becomes procurement. Because once you have the recursive acceleration argument, where the model can help rebuild pieces of the infrastructure future models rely on, it becomes a part of the feedback loop, not AI as a tool, but AI as a force multiplier on the tool-making process. That's why people keep using the phrase self-improvement, even if we're really talking about messy combination of agent workflows, scaffolding, automation, and compounding productivity. And then the tempo. OpenAI responded rapidly with GPT 5.3 codex, described as a publicly acknowledged tool for its own development process. Again, the key signal is the cadence. Progress compresses from years to months to weeks and now to minutes. The arms race logic moves from geopolitics to software. Now let's talk autonomy. When the AI can sustain work streams for hours and the horizon keeps expanding, you start getting a new kind of organization, one that doesn't sleep, a workforce that doesn't clock out, a system that can execute a project lifecycle while the operator is unconscious. This cuts both ways. Yes, you can get vulnerability discovery, coding, audit, defensive capabilities, but you get offensive risk because anything that finds holes can exploit them. And the white hat, black hat race becomes an agent on agent. Then comes the capital layer. It argues that the frontier AI labs are moving towards public listing territory around 2026 and that the spending on AI infrastructure becomes civilizational scale. Whether the exact numbers wobble, the behavior is unmistakable. Hyperscalers are pouring enormous money into computing because every other hyperscaler is doing it. It's a prisoner's dilemma with GPUs. Nobody wants to slow down because slowing down feels like surrender. And chips become the choke point. Manufacturing capacity becomes memory availability. Fab timelines all lag behind demand narratives. Scarcity drives pricing and power shifts from whoever controls the supply chain of the supply chain. Tools, chemicals, machines, energy. Then the compute beyond Earth thread returns. Orbital data centers, lunar infrastructure, solar arrays. Even if timeline slips, the direction matters. Once you imagine compute as an off-world industrial base, you're no longer talking about apps. You're talking about strategic industrial repositioning. And the physical world gets pulled into it too. Robotics, autonomous transport, robo-taxis, fleets, logistics without humans. The boundaries between digital economy and real economy dissolves because the software starts driving the hardware. This model war isn't about Anthropic against OpenAI. It's about intelligence becoming an industrial input, like steel, like electricity, and their competition to control its production at scale. We're watching the birth of continuous agentic organizations and simultaneous militarization of AI governance failure. It's all the same wave. The future isn't coming, it's already irritating. And the only real question left is whether our institutions adapt faster than machines do, because right now the machines are lapping the paperwork. Alright, okay, that's live show 168. Anchorage, AI War, Global Pressure from Minsk, Belarus, this Sunday evening, 15th of February 2026. And if you're feeling like the world is accelerating into a war, congratulations, you just have functioning pattern recognition. Because look at what we just walked through. Anchorage as branding, not breakthrough. AI governance collapsing because nobody wants to blink first. Pressure campaigns as a recurring industry. Cuba as a fuel-based multipolarity audit. And underneath it all, the real story. The phase transition, technology, capital, energy, and autonomy compounding faster than our institutions can digest. That's the through line. The world isn't just tense, it's syncing up. Multiple crises feeding each other, multiple accelerations landing at once, and every power acting like restraint is weakness. So here's the pitch. Don't get hypnotized by the daily headline theater. Watch the incentives, watch the logistics, watch the energy, watch the AI arms race, watch the pressure networks, because that's where the future is being built, not in speeches. If you watch live, you're a legend. If you're watching the replay, drop a comment with what you think is the biggest trigger point right now. Iran, Ukraine, AI, or the economic phase shift. And tell us what you think breaks first. And just a quick reminder, tonight's show was once again sponsored by The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco book, available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle versions. Because at this point, reality is basically beta testing the plot. Hit like, subscribe, share it where you can, and I'll see you on the next one. From Minsk, this is me out. Bye.